Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Geek Warning podcast, brought to you by the Escape Collective. I'm James Huang here in Boulder, Colorado, and as usual, I am joined by Dave Rome in Australia. Hi, Dave.
Hello.
We've also got Ronan McLaughlin up in Ireland. Hi, Ronan.
I can hear you. I can't see you. I've got too many tabs, and I've lost track of which one you're on. So, hi, James.
What a start.
Smooth as always. We are actually recording this episode on Halloween, but by the time this publishes, it'll be in November. But I guess we're going to kind of play a little bit with time here. But I'm kind of curious, Dave, I don't know if you're planning on heading out for Halloween or anything, but if you are and you have a costume, I have to wonder, what tool are you dressing up as for Halloween?
Yesterday was Halloween for you.
I'm going to disappoint. It's already been. It was a good 12 or more hours ago.
That's right.
Yeah, I didn't dress up. I didn't participate. I didn't have any candy. But if I were to dress up, it's a very good question. I don't know. I'd probably be a 3D printer and then just like hand people really useless trinkets. Yeah, I don't know.
That sounds cumbersome.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, aren't costumes meant to be like incredibly impractical? Like the more impractical it is, the better the costume.
Excellent.
I don't know. Put me on the spot there. I mean, you're asking an Australian about an American festival. It's becoming a thing here, but I don't think it should. So anyway.
I mean, it's just an excuse to dress up like an idiot and get free candy, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, I'm an adult, so I can do that and hand over money and get that from the shops. So do it any day.
Gotcha.
Anyway, yeah. Maybe let's just scrap this whole thing. Let's just
well, Ronan, moving on from Halloween, I know it's been a little while since you started this little project at home, but I'm kind of wondering, I kind of figured I'd check in. How's that garage coming along?
The garage is... Maybe I should give you a story about what I tried to do with the garage today. That the garage, you have Americanized me. Anyway, my dad's heading away for a bit of a holiday, and I asked him if his long wheelbase, high roof Sprinter Mercedes van was going to be available while he was away. Not so that I could drive it anywhere, not so that I could go anywhere, but just so that I could use the back of it as like a temporary garage to fill all the stuff from the actual garage into it to free up space so that I could get the inside of the garage finished. So I don't know if that tells you how far I've got with the garage, but it's a work in progress. It's probably the best way to put it.
And winter is coming.
Yeah, it's a bit like is it that cathedral in Barcelona that's never going to be finished? It's a little bit like that.
All right. Well, hopefully you're not going to have to hand off the task to your next 9 generations of McLaughlins or something.
It's very possible.
Okay. Well, we're definitely going to wrap up this podcast much sooner than I guess you're going to have your garage finished. Even though we have got a pretty big list of stuff on the run sheet today. We've got the unexpected return of the Lotus brand name to road bikes. We've got some good and maybe some not so good news about SRAM road brake levers. I got some definite bad news about Wiggle and Isla bikes. We're going to talk about optimum tire width for road bikes and whether mountain bike drivetrain preferences might be a regional thing. We're going to find out what our favorite road pedals are. All right, let's get into the news. Ronan, this new Lotus road bike is, it's definitely wild, and it is also most definitely not what I was expecting. What the heck is this thing?
Yes, that's the Lotus Type 136, which is, well, it was unveiled yesterday for the listeners, and it's unveiled tomorrow for us. We caught wind of this bike a couple of weeks ago, I think, and the press release literally landed into my inbox this evening, just about an hour or so before we started recording here. So details are a little thin at the moment, but basically, yeah, Lotus are announcing their first road bike in a long, long time in London tomorrow. And it's not just a road bike, but it's an aero road bike, which will come as a little surprise for anybody who knows their Lotus history. But what might come as a surprise is the fact that it's actually an e-aero road bike or an aero e-bike, or I'm not. I don't think we've settled on how we phrase that yet, but you get the gist. It's an assisted aero bike.
James, you're surprised by it, but I don't know if I am. I mean, it kind of feels almost exactly what you'd expect of a modern day car company doing a bicycle. I mean, it's you look at all the other automotive brands that have their names to bicycles, and it's I don't know, these days it's certainly a theme. And yeah, I mean, this thing looks pretty fast, and it looks kind of interesting, but yeah, I don't know if I'm super surprised that they decided to make it assisted.
I'm not really surprised at all. I think I'd caught one that there would be an e-bike and a road bike, and I think that was actually a mistake on my behalf, in that it is an e-bike, but it can sort of be converted to a standard road bike, because the battery for this, it's the HPS, the high performance system e-bike motor, which I actually tried myself a few years back in a domestic e-bike. But basically, it's said to be the lightest e-bike motor available. It's sort of a mid-drive, but crucially, you sort of retain the standard crankset on the bike. So your Shimano or SRAM or Campag, you can use whatever wheels you want. There's actually no part of the system built into the hub or the wheel or anything like that. So for all intents and purposes, the bike is a standard road bike if you remove the battery, which is built into a bottle, which sits in a bottle cage on the seat tube. So I think the mistake there was that you remove the bottle, you've removed the main part of the weight, and you've got a road bike. But I had first sort of assumed that meant that there's actually an e-bike and a road bike coming. But no, there's not only is there not two different models coming, but there's actually only 136 of these Type 136 Lotus e-bikes that will be available. And just to throw some, not delve into all the stats here, because there actually isn't all that much provided in the press release, but effectively the full e-bike here weighs in at 9.8 kilos, which is pretty impressive in terms of e-bike
number.
weights.
There's also another impressive number associated with this bike.
Oh yes, impressive or scary? Let's go with scary, given it's Halloween. I think you're talking about the £20,000 price tag. Is that right?
Yeah, which I think by current exchange rates is 1.8 million Australian.
Billion, Dave.
Oh, billion. I missed a couple of zeros. Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's expensive. There's only 136 of them available. I think I'm going to preempt the reaction to this, and a lot of people questioning an aero e-bike. What the heck? I actually don't mind that, really. I'm sort of looking at James, I know it's not for you. You've already said you may be not a fan of the aesthetics here, but I quite like this, and I would quite like them to bring out a non-assisted version. But in terms of road bikes, I think this is a pretty good looking bike that I would happily ride if I wanted an road bike.
I mean, it's almost visually, it's almost like a weird hybrid between a Cervelo S5 and like the Hope bike in some ways.
Yeah, and I mean, Lotus did have some involvement in that Hope, didn't they? And this Lotus 136 that is unveiled this week, it does sort of have the wide stance seat stays, and there's definitely a few cues from that Hope Lotus track bike. But yeah, I mean, obviously aero bikes are said to aid performance. They're aerodynamically optimized and more aerodynamically efficient and all that. But let's be honest, a lot of us, myself included in the past, buy these bikes because we like the look of them. And if you like the look of aero road bikes, but you want an or an assisted road bike, well then, I mean, this is, I can't think of any others that spring to mind, like aero road bikes that are available.
Firstly, I mean, aero makes perfect sense when you've got such a small battery because you want to optimize how far you can go with that bike. But the other side of it is, I'm kind of giggling to myself here because in Australia and the UK, it's basically EU e-bike laws, so you're kind of speed limited to 25 kilometers per hour, which isn't actually fast enough to get any of that aero benefit. So yeah.
I mean, you still get the aero benefit, Dave. You just don't really get to like enjoy it as much. I think it's probably safe to say.
Start to tap into it in the smallest sense.
I think that gets to my, I think there will be a lot of kickback to this online. The idea of an aero road bike, especially Dave, as you mentioned with the speed limit. The bigger problem for me though is just the speed limits. I know there is a place for them, and especially in inner cities or in urban environments, using e-bikes on cycle paths. We don't want people riding at 50k an hour or whatever. But I know of plenty of friends and family who either want or have an e-bike, and for the most part they wanted to be able to enjoy the group ride that they've always participated in, as their fitness is on the decline for whatever reason. But with the speed limits currently in place in Europe here, at least, what they've effectively got is a bike that helps them ride up to a speed which is typically below the speed of the group ride. Mm-hmm. And from that point onwards, all they've got is a hindrance rather than an assist. So, I think that's the bigger issue here.
Yep.
I mean, imagine the disappointment on behalf of anyone who's buying one of these things and subject to those sorts of laws, because I mean, Lotus has always been about, sort of lightweight performance, and, certainly now they're really big into aerodynamics. And, but then if you were to hop on this Type 136 and be limited to 25k an hour as far as the assists, it's like, oh, this thing's so much fun. Actually, it's not really fun at all.
I might, was it Colin Chapman was the founder of Lotus? I might use one of his legendary quotes in response to that there, James, in that, while I'm not saying you should do anything with your e-bikes, I'm definitely not saying that. Colin Chapman did say that rules are for the obedience of fools and for the interpretation of smart men. So take from that what you will. Saying no more.
Perfect. All right. Well, I would say that you probably should not expect that we are going to have a full review of a Type 136 Lotus anytime soon.
But I'm not completely opposed if Lotus want us to test a car and bike package.
I was just going to say, if Lotus did want to maybe bring Ronin in.
Because that's how this bike is going to be purchased, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be purchased alongside the SUV. And yeah, I mean, it's a little out of pace with the car pricing. Looking in Australia, it's like 20% of the car's price, which is more than I thought. But anyway, I'm not opposed if they want me to do a bike and car package test. Never done it before. It'll definitely come across like I'm a shill, but I might make an exception.
I'm sure we can figure out something for this, Dave. We can figure out something. I do think Lotus should maybe see about putting together a package deal for this thing and for customers in general. It's like, buy the SUV, get the bike for free. It'd be kind of like the old like Jetta Trek from the 90s.
Mm-hmm. I think it usually works in the opposite direction, James, that if you buy the car, you get the opportunity to pay through the nose for the bike.
Yes.
I don't think it comes as for free with the car. It's usually the other way that, if there's something adjacent to a car, be that a Ferrari, a Porsche, or whatever, you've got the car, then you've got the opportunity to pay like an absolutely enormous price tag for something related to the car. So,
and then you'll get a free hat.
I don't think there's anything for free, Dave.
Oh, okay. All right.
No, you get the special edition hat that you have to pay 200 euros for. Anyway. Well, like I said, I don't know if we're going to expect to see a review anytime soon, but that would be kind of fun. We'll stay tuned for that one. More likely on the review front, Ratio Technology is a UK company that we've been keeping an eye on for quite a while. They've just announced a new retrofit kit. Works for a 10 and 11 speed SRAM double tap road levers. So that would be the old mechanical levers. And their retrofit kit will allow you to run those levers with 12 speed Shimano cassettes. without having to buy new levers, a rear derailleur, or even a free hub body, since 12-speed Shimano cassettes fit on a regular 11-speed HG free hub. So for £100, I'm not sure what that works out to as far as their retail price in euros or US dollars or Australian dollars. But for that, you get
14,500 Aussie.
Yeah. But for that modest sum, you get a new ratchet body for your right-hand lever, which is very easy to install. You get a pair of new rear derailleur pulleys. And that's it. That's basically all you need. You'll need to supply your own Shimano 12-speed compatible cassette and chain, but Ratio actually even specifies that 11-speed chain rings should work just fine. So I'm not seeing any downside here at all. Like, I've been a big fan of what Ratio has been doing for a while now, and I would almost argue this is their best kit to date.
Yes. Also, why would you do it?
Well, basically, if you want the gearing advantages that you get for Shimano's current 12-speed stuff, which I think is really good, but that you also really like the action of SRAM double tap levers.
The gearing options is in the Hyperglide Plus shifting ramps, or the gearing ratios, which are basically the same as what SRAM have.
Well, yeah, but if you have a 10 or 11-speed SRAM mechanical road group set right now, and you are interested in switching over to a more modern setup while retaining your mechanical drivetrain, doing it with this Shimano setup would most likely be a lot cheaper than using their SRAM 12-speed conversion kit, because the SRAM stuff, you've got to switch over to everything.
Yeah, gotcha.
But with this Shimano one, if you already have an 11-speed SRAM mechanical drivetrain in particular, you supposedly don't even have to get new chain rings unless they're worn. You don't have to swap out your wheels or hubs or anything. You get this kit for £100 and then a Shimano 12-speed chain and cassette, and supposedly you're done.
More options are good. I still just question why I'd want to take, say, an 11-speed SRAM group, keep the shifters, keep all the derailleurs, keep the kind of subpar front shifting, and then add an extra cog in the back to make it more sensitive to adjustment. I don't know. Maybe I'm missing the plot there. I mean, Shimano Hyperglide Plus is great, but I don't know. I kind of feel like if you got a fully well-functioning 11-speed group set, just keep it 11-speed.
I think it's really just if you're after those kind of more flexible 12-speed gear ratios that are offered now, I think it's just a matter of that. And if you just, like I said, if you just prefer that double tap shift actuation, that lever style or the shape or whatever, then that seems like a pretty good way to go. Because as much as I agree for sure that Shimano mechanical stuff works really well, not everyone likes that light action, and some people just like that really tactile feel of double tap.
Yeah.
And again, for that, for really what's not a whole lot of money, that seems like a pretty good setup.
Yeah. Yeah. No, kudos to Ratio for continuously doing this and good pricing. Yeah, I don't know if I'll be converting my red 22 bike anytime soon, but we'll see.
I'm intrigued. I might bring one in. We'll see. But in some not so great news, but also not particularly bad news about SRAM, we do have a fresh recall to talk about, but it's definitely not what we were expecting based on the headlines. Dave, you want to provide some details here?
Yeah, I kind of feel a bit sorry for SRAM having to call this one. They're calling it a stop sale at the moment, so they've sent out an announcement to dealers, and I've certainly received a few DMs from dealers that have received the stop sale notice and then shared it before they've realized what it's for. Basically, it covers all aftermarket sold current 12-speed brake lever units from Apex through to Red, and sold in recent time. And yeah, it basically means it comes down to the fact that there's too much thread locker on the clamp bolt for the levers. So when you torque them up, the measured torque, or the torque that your torque wrench says, is not the same as doesn't reach the intended clamping force. So yeah, that you're basically under torquing them on the bar, and that can lead to the lever slipping. And in theory, it can be a safety issue if the lever slips all the way down.
Well, and what's interesting is this is officially a stop sale, but it does not apply to any bikes that are supplied OEM and also does not apply to any bikes that have already been assembled. So it only applies to aftermarket levers that are still in the box, or basically that still haven't been installed on anything.
Yeah, it's all. I mean, it's not that silly. Like, obviously, there's an issue there, and you don't want levers to be swiveling on bars, but it's also a little bit silly. Like, I've had this issue myself with SRAM where I've torqued the lever and then it slipped and it moves slightly, and then you torque it further.
How
It's
how loose is it when when you get the torque setting, but obviously it's not tight enough? Is it like you notice it before you get on the bike, or is it you notice it when you hit
I
it?
noticed it when I got on the bike, and it just shifted inward a little bit. But it wasn't like, it's not like the lever falls off. You've got bar tape as well supporting it. There's a brake hose there, so it's not like it went very far. I was just like, oh, that's a bit annoying. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of funny for me because last year at the old place, I did an article about correct torque wrench usage, and I worked with a reader on that who now works for NASA, Alex Boone, and he.
Do they use torque wrenches there? That's sure that's not that important.
I think they've just started. So yeah, I mean they've
Okay.
really watched what the bicycle industry has been doing and have adopted those practices. But yeah,
Please no.
he made a comment of something called running torque, where they'll actually figure out the kind of the friction on a bolt. So say there's a dried thread locker already on the bolt, they'll figure out how much torque is required to keep that bolt moving, and then they'll add that to the torque figure. So say if you had these SRAM shift clamp bolts, and the running torque was 2 Newton meters to get the bolt to turn, and the end required torque was 6 Newton meters, his recommendation was that you'd actually tighten it to 8 Newton meters. And then at the time, I actually asked SRAM, I'm like, what's your take of this? And they're like, oh no, it makes no difference. Our thread locker acts as a lubricant and therefore isn't required, so you don't need to get too fancy with it. And I remember I looked it up yesterday, and I concluded that article with a little caption that basically said, I know enough now that this topic needs a further deep dive and more research than what the companies are saying. So yeah, there you go. Turns out it did need a further deep dive. So yeah.
Should we clarify for a second about it before people go and start reading like 5 Newton meters plus 2 for running?
Yeah.
That we're not saying
don't do that.
Like every
yeah, I mean, still, yeah. End of the day, stick to the recommended torques from the manufacturers. But it does seem like someone from NASA might have had the answer.
Have either of you actually seen the official NASA manual for fasteners and torque and that sort of thing?
Yes.
It is a fascinating document.
Yes.
I thought you were going to say the manual for a rocket or something.
No, I do not have one of those manuals.
All right. Pretty big, I'd imagine.
Yep. So yeah. Anyway, I found that kind of fitting, given it's a topic I accidentally touched on in the past. But it's yeah. So anyway, if
Back
you
to
do
levers
have
a
these
second,
levers,
Dave.
yes.
Yeah. What is that? You want to say if you do have those levers, or if you've just bought these levers, or you have them sitting in a box? What's the course of it? You don't have to send them back, do you?
No, they send you a replacement clamp bolt kit. Basically, it's only the bolt that has the thread locker on it, and therefore only the bolt needs replacing. So yeah, the nut is not a problem. I'm gonna go ahead and get myself into some trouble here and say probably scraping off the thread locker from the bolt will achieve much the same thing.
Well, and the funny thing is, whenever I assemble stuff like that on my own bikes, I don't scrape the thread locker off, but I still grease the threads, mainly because I don't like how those pre-Loctited bolts often feel when I'm assembling stuff. Because even if the right amount is applied, then it just kind of never feels right to me. And I've always just lubed them, but and I suspect that would probably also solve the case here. But I think in the big world of sort of legal requirements and recalls and stop sales and that sort of thing, I'm guessing that SRAM probably had no option but to do this officially as a stop sale, which is kind of unfortunate because, again, like this doesn't really strike me as a huge deal, but it certainly sounds like a huge deal, and it's not really. Just it's giving people another opportunity to use SRAM as a punching bag.
The irony of all this is that I was out today on a SRAM equipped bike, an aftermarket SRAM equipped bike, that I recently put fenders onto, and one of the screws for the fender mounts didn't have thread lock on it and worked its way loose during the ride. So there I was with too much thread lock on my SRAM levers and not enough on my fender mount, and that was a rattly ride for the rest of the way.
Oh, well, you should have just taken both of those pieces of hardware out and just rubbed them together, and they should have evened out. It would have been fine.
Thought crossed my mind, but A, it wasn't that annoying, and B, I'm not sure that would have worked.
All right. Well, anyway, moving on.
Well, before we do,
sorry.
James, is there any word of SRAM doing a recall on a product in the market for this, or is it literally just a only new product that hasn't been sold yet?
If I was reading that recall or that stop sale notice correctly, my understanding is that it only applies to components that have not yet been assembled, and packaged aftermarket only.
Is that because if it's been assembled and used and it's slipped, you've tightened it up and fixed the problem?
Probably.
All right, okay.
Presumably, or maybe there's some sort of weird legal classification. I'm not really sure, but yeah, my understanding is that this is not as big a deal as some people are making it out to be, but still worth mentioning. But anyway, what is certainly a very, very big deal. Last week we reported that massive online retailer Wiggle had entered self-administration due to some rather suddenly calamitous financial issues. And unfortunately, just a few days later, the situation has definitely gotten a lot worse. Ronan, what is the latest with Wiggle?
Yeah, so sorry, I'm slightly distracted as you're reading that, just because the updates are actually coming in as we're recording here. They officially entered administration Tuesday of last week, but it was reported in the Gazette last Friday. We had a story up on that. You can check that out if you haven't heard it. But I am getting reports this evening that actually they had a pretty large number of redundancies today within Wiggle. Quite a lot of people laid off. These are unconfirmed reports as of yet. I'm not sure if we want to dive into too much here on the podcast when we don't have many details, but I think it's pretty, from what I'm hearing, it's widespread within the Wiggle company, well, across Wiggle CRC as it's now known.
Not great.
No, definitely not. Yeah, some more speculation, but yeah, I think while we're waiting for confirmation, it's probably best not to delve into that in too much detail. I mean, it wasn't looking good, but if these reports are true, then I think that's happened faster than maybe we would have even expected.
Yeah, I think there was at least a little bit of a glimmer of hope when they originally reported that they had gone into self-administration, because there was maybe the chance that they could reorganize on their own and come out of this. But then when we started hearing things about how Signa Sports North America, for example, had basically completely shut down on just a couple days' notice. From what I understand, sort of no severance package for employees, and no real plan, obviously, from what I can tell, basically just given how quickly all this stuff is happening. So yeah, while there was a glimmer of hope initially, it sounds like things are maybe much worse than we were assuming initially. But either way, while we don't have details, it definitely doesn't sound good. And looking at a bunch of mechanic and shop boards that I belong to on Facebook, there certainly is a lot of concern in the independent bike shop world that whatever stock Wiggle is still holding on to might get just dumped onto the mass market at heavy discounts. And given the amount of stock that they very likely have on hand, in the short term, it would probably make for a lot of really good deals for general consumers. But as far as the general industry goes, it's not going to be a good thing.
There's also just the fact that, especially in the UK, distributors have had a tough enough time of it this year, with a few of them already, unfortunately, going out of business. But undoubtedly, there will be, distributors with, large outstanding balances with Wiggle, with CRC. Will those get covered now? Very unlikely, you would have to assume. Those distributors, they may or may not have insurance to cover that. But even if they see out that sort of tide, then, ultimately, the end of this, they will have lost one of their biggest customers. Out the other side of this, if Wiggle and CRC isn't saved, or if it isn't saved and and retained in a similar sort of structure that it currently has. So yeah, it's not great news all around.
Lost one of their biggest customers, and also one of their biggest outlets for getting product out of the UK market, right? Like if the UK market's saturated for product, Wiggle historically has been that outlet to push it to a global audience. So yeah, I think the domino effect here is going to be pretty significant, and I think that's why it keeps making all the headlines, is that they had become such a dominant player that I think it's going to hurt people in ways that they perhaps aren't seeing at the moment.
Yeah, and a lot of people are speculating, probably correctly, that one factor that definitely did not help Wiggle financially was Brexit, just because it suddenly became, at the very least, more complicated for them to ship stuff out of the UK. But that may have also played a hand into another business domino that recently fell, which is Isla Bikes. It's the UK-based brand that not only primarily focused on premium kids bikes, but actually launched the segment 18 years ago. So they sadly just announced that they are ceasing operations once their current stocks are sold. And the official announcement, they didn't provide a reason for shutting down specifically. Although we do know that segment has certainly gotten increasingly competitive. The market in general is not great to the bicycle industry as a whole. And as I mentioned, Brexit wasn't exactly kind to UK-based bike brands, and Isla Bikes also had a fork recall last year that certainly didn't help either. But I gotta say that this one kind of hits me particularly hard. I actually wrote an article about it a few days ago. So my kid, she's 10 now, but this would have been, 6.5 years ago now. I mean, she learned to ride on a 14-inch Isla bike it was an absolutely amazing bike. It was just an astoundingly high-quality kid bike. And I have lost count of how many people mentioned in the comments on that article that their kids had also grown up on Isla bikes, and they had bikes that had been handed down to third, fourth, fifth kids, that sort of thing, and they're still holding up great. I find it painfully ironic that Isla Bikes may have been in some ways a victim of their own success.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you say, they sort of created the category, at least in certain markets, especially in the UK and the US. But yeah, in recent years, you look at the kids bike competition, and basically what set Isla Bikes apart has now almost become the status quo. You've got Specialized and Trek and all these big brands that have huge distribution, producing bikes that are in many ways are now competitive. But back then, 18 years ago, they weren't. The bikes were pretty poorly designed and not well suited for the target market. So yeah, it's cool to see how far things have come, but yeah, also a shame that the first mover and the innovator kind of is the one to pay the price.
Yeah, it's super sad because if you look at what set those bikes apart, it wasn't so much that Isla Bikes had, they certainly weren't like a huge company and were able to leverage huge buying advantages and huge amounts of capital and that sort of thing. They were just so much smarter about how the bikes were designed and spec'd. And then if you were to essentially take that knowledge and take those learnings and apply them to a company that has just a lot more muscle behind it, at that point, I guess, hindsight's always 20/20 and everything, but it's hard to see how Isla Bikes would have continued on if and when every mainstream company gets into that market, or at least offers something at that higher end in the kids bikes. So yeah, I mean, looking at the other brands that are out there right now, Early Rider, Woom, Frog, stuff like that. They have all followed in Isla Bikes' footsteps, and yeah, you got to wonder if Giant, Specialized, Trek, if everyone starts competing in that space and are also able to leverage their own big business advantages, then you got to wonder if more of those companies are going to go away.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that at the moment in the bike industry, that there's a condensation of brands. I think it was completely oversaturated. But yeah, I think what we'll probably end up seeing from this is just that the big brands just get bigger.
Yeah, bummer. Well, last bit of tech news before we move on to our next segment. POC's got a new helmet that actually looks kind of interesting and has sparked some discussion internally. We were just talking about it before we started recording. So POC's got this new helmet called the Omni Beacon. It has...
Do you get this one for free if you buy a Lotus in the matching car?
No.
We'll have to clarify that. It's a good question, Dave.
Okay, all right. Sorry, I'll let you go on with what it is.
Anyway, POC, it's the new helmet called the Omni Beacon. It's focusing on low light visibility, which is particularly applicable given the change of seasons in the Northern Hemisphere. Intentionally made with some bright colors on the back for kind of passive visibility, but it also has some integrated lights that are built into the back of the helmet directly. So it's not a clip-on thing, batteries internal, USB rechargeable, that sort of thing. Ronan, you had some thoughts on this thing. Like, it sounded like you actually liked the idea of this more than helmets that just have a clip-on light, right?
Yeah, I think one of the key things there you mentioned USB rechargeable, because this is built into POC's Omni helmet, which already exists. A couple of years ago, they came out with the Omni Eternal, which was like the foil solar-powered light that never needed recharged and sort of recognized when it was on your head and automatically switched on the light at the back of that. That light wasn't great, let's say. It wasn't really bright enough. I think it was a fantastic concept, and perhaps it develops into something in the future, but the helmet that I had just wasn't really bright enough. But it did really pique my interest at the time, because I am a fan of having a light on your helmet. What I'm not a fan of, though, is having a light attached to your helmet, sort of aftermarket, or taking one of your own daytime running lights and clipping it onto your helmet, because should you fall in that helmet, having an extra sort of contraption attached to it is unlikely to improve the helmet's performance, and from what I understand, could actually be quite dangerous. Could actually lead to other injuries should you have a chunky light, or a GoPro for that matter, which is another common thing to attach to your helmets. That's just not a great idea in general. So I like the idea that POC now have integrated a brighter light that is USB rechargeable into the same helmet.
I think also attaching things externally to your helmet makes it non-compliant, at least in certain countries. I believe that's the case with Australia's compliancy laws. And, I think if you were involved in a crash and say you had a GoPro or a light mounted to your helmet, I think it would give, say, the insurance companies a way to get out of paying out if they really wanted to, because you're wearing a non-compliant helmet. So yeah, there's more to it than well, it's exactly what you say, Ron. But yeah, there's a bigger picture. It makes sense.
Unfortunately, the injury may not be the last of the problems.
Correct. Yes.
That attaching a light or a GoPro might have to your helmet.
Yes, you'll also have a smashed GoPro and a smashed light.
Well, I just meant that you wouldn't have insurance payout.
Yes.
Listeners can place the rank those issues to their own preferences there. But I just it seems from the we've only just got the press release again a couple of hours before we started recording here. POC helmets, they're pretty well known quantity at this point. I have a couple of POC helmets, and I as I said, I really liked the idea a couple of years ago of the Eternal. It just wasn't really bright enough for me. I still felt that I had to add other daytime running lights to the bike, whereas this seems like it might address that issue.
Yeah, and historically, I'd say that for me has been the common theme with semi-integrated lights with helmets, or integrated lights with helmets, is they've always lacked necessary brightness for daytime running. We haven't seen this helmet personally yet. We don't have it in our hands, but for me, that's the big question.
The like, not to rattle off all the figures here, I'm sure it'll be on POC's website if somebody wants them all, but the Vivid mode offers 32 lumens. So, and 13 hours of runtime in that.
Yeah, POC does. I did notice that POC is very careful in their wording, because they are very specific in saying that this is for lower light visibility. They are not claiming that this is a daytime running light.
Yep.
And for reference, or I guess for the sake of comparison, that 32 lumen output that POC is claiming, we can compare that to, say, like a Bontrager Flare RT rear light. And that in daytime flashing mode puts out 90 lumens, which granted lumens isn't the be all end all as far as visibility goes, but in terms of just total output, that gives you some idea of what the relative brightness is going to be. So it does seem like this is just sort of like a low light thing if you're kind of caught out after like approaching dusk, that sort of thing. But it is still nice that it's built in. You don't have to worry about not having it attached to your bike. But either way, I think we should get a couple of these in. We'll see how they go. So look for a review on these sooner than later, I think. All right. Well, let's wrap up our news for this week and go ahead and move into our on your mind and over the head of your family segment. So kind of want to talk about some happier topics, I guess. And I guess we're going to start with mountain bike here first, because Dave, you and I have both ridden SRAM's new transmission mountain bike stuff a whole bunch over the last few months. And I think we agree on a lot of things about it. Stuff like the ability to shift under power and that sort of thing, the durability. However, we most definitely disagree on how impactful the shift speed, or rather the lack thereof, I think, is. You had an interesting theory on why that might be. What are you thinking here?
I come from single speeding where I just don't shift. And no. I think it's regional. I think it seems like you were telling me that yourself and a lot of your riding friends are used to sort of like using every single shift indentation on your XTR shifter, like all 3 to 4 or 4 upshifts in one sweep, or if you go back a few more years, grip shift, where you just work your way through the whole cassette in one swoop. And you're saying that often in your trails, you're having to do that pretty frequently, where you're just having these massive speed changes. For me, like, I don't know, I find our terrain, maybe it's just riding style more than geographical, but for me, like, I don't think I ever changed more than 2 gears at one time on any gear system. So yeah, I don't know. I just stood out to me as an interesting thing that I like the very slow shift speed that transmission insists, because it will only shift 1 gear at a time. It makes sure that the chain's fully wrapped onto the next cassette cog before it'll let you shift it again, basically. It just didn't bother me. But yeah, it has been a huge barrier for you. So I don't know. What are your thoughts, James?
Well, because I think when you and I were talking about it, I think what we had determined was that your trails, it sounds like they're kind of more rolling. Whereas
not necessarily. Yeah. I mean, there definitely are rolling trails, but no, we have a lot of sandstone with like sharp corners and little G outs and yeah.
But as far as like big elevation changes, like a lot of our stuff, I mean, it's basically like steep up, steep down, not a whole lot in between. So it's not uncommon at all for us to have pretty big changes in speed versus slow to, whether it's slow to fast or fast to slow. And while I definitely do a whole bunch of single shifts, it's almost probably equally often that I'm shifting 2, 3, 4 gears at a time, just because there's such an abrupt change in speed when you start heading downhill or whatever. And then at that point, I think this is where we're having conflicting views on this stuff, is because I was frequently trying to shift like halfway down the cassette in one go, and then just waiting an eternity for that to happen, and then almost kind of forgetting how many times I pushed the button at that point. And then like when I raced the Breck Epic back in August, I found that I shouldn't say almost every time, but a lot of the times when the trail started heading downhill at that point, I'd upshift a bunch of gears and then I'd have to sort of downshift another one or something, because I kept overshooting it as I was waiting, and just like kept like frantically pushing the button, trying to get it to go. But yeah, it seems like, I think I'm going to agree with you, Dave, because it does seem to be a regional thing, or at least a type of trail thing, because I have talked to a bunch of people who say that they don't mind the slowness at all. And then I have also talked to a bunch of people who are like, I can't handle the slowness because I just can't shift enough gears quickly enough.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm kind of the opinion that it's probably equal parts regional and equal parts riding style. But yeah, it's definitely does seem to be rider dependent. So I think the conclusion that we came up to is that if you currently ride, say, Shimano or or previous SRAM, and you are forever dumping a bunch of gears, or if you're one of the rare people that actually owns grip shift still for the reason of the ability to dump through gears, then you're probably going to hate transmission.
Or at least be frustrated with it
Yeah.
to some degree anyway. Because again, like the shift security and that sort of thing is absolutely incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Shift speed, not so much. But apparently whether or not that matters is kind of very rider and region dependent. So your mileage may vary. Moving back to the road though, Ronan, you recently posted on your Instagram account that you were asking people for questions about the review that you're wrapping up on that new Cannondale Super 6 Evo 4. And there was one in particular that seemed pretty ripe for discussion because someone was asking what you thought was the sweet spot in terms of tire width for that bike. It's something that balances rolling resistance and grip and pressure for comfort. That person was thinking general use context, including what would make sense to take to the Alps, for example, alongside normal local riding. And this is kind of I don't want to say a can of worms, but it certainly is a pretty big topic, I think. So, Ronan, what would you think is the best tire size, I guess maybe for that type of bike in general?
Yeah, I mean, I posted that yesterday evening, and that comment came back pretty quickly. And I tried to have this conversation with my wife, who's pretty sleep deprived at the moment, looking after a 13-week-old kid, and then I tried to have it with my nearly 5-year-old daughter, and neither of them were too interested. So I thought I would bring it up here. Seems it was over their heads or something. I'm not sure, but or either that or they just were entirely not interested. So I thought a bit about this. I'll just give you my answer first of all. I think maybe a 30 on the rear and a 28 in the front would be the way I would go.
Interesting.
I mean, it was Matt Search, I think is his name, who had popped this question into my comments and my DMs. We normally take questions through our Escape members Discord, but we'll make an exception this once. And he had specifically asked about, if you were taking a trip to the Alps, in which case I think maybe a 28, matched front and rear would be closer to what I would go for. But for the roads I'm riding here, that Ridley Falcon I reviewed recently was delivered with a 30 on the rear and a 28 in the front, which I really quite liked. It's not something you see all that often. And so I think that would be the way I would go. What I would not do is run with the tires that Cannondale ship with that bike, which is tube type only GP 5000s in size 25mm, which I can't really work out why you would do that other than you got a cracking deal on 25mm.
I was going to say
tires.
My understanding is that a lot of tire companies were caught a little off guard with the sheer demand for tubeless 28s or 30mm tires. So I'm wondering if that spec choice is purely and nothing more availability related.
The only other answer I can come up with is perhaps the 25s being smaller might weigh slightly less.
Oh, they definitely do.
When you pick it up,
and
when you pick it up in a bike shop, that
yeah,
feels lighter then. So
yeah,
yeah, that, and I'm not sure what I can't remember anyway what Cannondale was saying was optimum with that frame and fork and with the wheels as far as aerodynamic performance goes. The other thing to remember too, as far as spec on complete bikes go, because it's something that I feel like we talked about a fair bit, how sometimes spec seems to be kind of behind the times as far as what people are actually running. Is we kind of have to remember that a lot of these spec sheets are determined quite far in advance. And especially with how certain things are changing very, very quickly, and I would say tire sizes would fall into that category. A 25, which on that rim probably inflates closer to 26, maybe even 27. But at the time, that may have been just a perfectly fine option for pure road riding, and I would say it still is a pretty good option for road riding. But certainly, the way things have evolved in terms of preferences, 28 I think would be the more fitting.
Yeah. I think you're touching on something really important there, James, which is what is known to be fastest on the bike. So if that bike in its stock configuration were to go, say, to Tour magazine into a wind tunnel, how that bike would stack up. And that's the same reason why Specialized with their latest tarmac still equip 26 mil tires. Because that's the fastest, that's the best optimized tire for the Roval Rapide rims. So yeah, I think there's still an element there of their potentially building the fastest bike that they can with the components they have, even though it doesn't necessarily make sense for the end user.
Agreed, but also, I mean, if you're going to do that, then put narrow handlebars on and
Yes,
not the wide. Which was another question that popped up on the Instagram post: is why are they putting these wider bars on bikes that are designed to be aero?
Yeah, and that same question came up in my Polygon Helios review that was published a few days ago, which has a 42 centimeter flared handlebar on a 54 centimeter bike. Yep. So yeah, I mean, it flares out to like 45 centimeters at the drops, which is definitely not belonging on an aero road bike. And fundamentally, it comes back to, I think it's just a legacy thing that people are used to that bar width on that size bike, and that it doesn't prevent the bike from being sold.
It maybe goes back to what I mentioned earlier as well, that while we are thinking about optimized performance, a lot of people, myself included in the past, buy bikes based on how they look. And if you like the look of an aero bike and you don't really care about aero, you might not care what width your bars are. But anyway, that's slightly getting off topic. The other thing I just wanted to mention, though, on the 25s that were supplied with that bike, those rims are pretty wide. I can't remember the exact external width figure off the top of my head, but they are very, very wide rims. And the first thing I thought when I took it out of the box was those tires are just far too narrow. Like the concern wasn't in terms of the internal rim width, but the rim sort of was so much wider than the tire. I was concerned about hitting a pothole or something like that and just damaging the rim, or even a cat's eye or something. So one of the first things I did with that bike was change the tire width, which I think is going to be one of the first things most people want to do, which I just think is all kinds of wrong. If you've paid $8,000 sterling for a bike, you kind of want it to arrive with 28 mil tires, I think, and with at least rim match tires. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, we've spoken about quoted tire width so far. You said 28 front, 30 rear. What's your ideal measured width? Is that your ideal measured width?
You've kind of caught me on the hop there. I'm not willing to to commit to a measure width just yet.
Okay, because for me,
it's so it depends on the wheels and all. It's just
For me, I mean, this is as you said, it depends on the wheels and the exact situation and all. But for me, like if I were just to randomly pick a tire size for pure road riding, I'd probably want to land on roughly a 30 mil measured width these days.
I mean, that's kind of where I've settled for a while now too, just because while I know a 25 or 26 or 27 or whatever would be a little bit lighter for sure, and certainly in a lot of rims it would be more aerodynamic up front. But if you do have a appropriately wide rim, and wide externally, I should say, when we're talking about aerodynamics here, but if you do have an appropriately wide rim, I've found that a 28 mil printed width, which would on a lot of those rims would often puff up to about 30. At that point, you have so much footprint on the ground. They're really not heavy. And if it's on the right rim and if it's on a bike that can handle that sort of thing, they're aerodynamically very, very good. And they're just so capable. And what I like about that combo is while it may not be the absolute best aerodynamically compared to something maybe a slightly narrow up front, it's just so versatile. You basically can just hop on the bike and just go ride just about whatever you want. Like even unpaved roads, if they're in good condition, you can handle those too. But for me, I'd say like the ultimate versatility would be a 28 printed width front and rear. But I do like Ronan's idea of running a 30-28, just because that would be even more cushioning and drive traction, that sort of thing out back.
And my reasoning is, the cushioning and grip and that out back, but also there's slightly less of an aero penalty for running that wider tire at the rear. For me, at the front, this bike, any wheel set, if I'm thinking, as I usually am, about performance, I would want to be matching the measured width to the rim width. Not matching like for like, but the whole rule of 105 and all that. if I'm getting that into tire selection, that would probably be my first protocol in deciding what size to go with. Because from there, then you can dial in whichever specific tire you like. May have more or less grip than another. So, and obviously pressures a whole other matter entirely. So yeah, I think like the stock wheels that came with this bike, I'm quite liking them. But for considerable amount of time I've ridden this bike, it's had different wheel sets in it for a variety of different reasons. And more often than not, with the rims that are on offer for this type of bike in 2023 and going forward into next year as well, they're more often than not optimized for a 28 mil tire these days.
Yep. Just on this topic, I think for me, it's a reminder to remind people that if you don't own a set of very cheap calipers and you're not measuring your actual measured width of tires, you're probably missing out on some very, very affordable gains, because there's a high chance that your tires are a different width to what's printed on the sidewall.
And by affordable, you mean free, because that is a tire pressure is definitely one of the best.
You got to spend $10 on a really cheap caliper, but yeah.
Well, yes.
Yep.
But as far as just changing the tire pressure in your tires, I mean that is the number one performance variable that you can play with. Huge effect, huge positive or negative effect, and definitely the easiest to play around with. So it's something to think about. But anyway, I'd say this is one of those areas where we're pretty much all in agreement, which was kind of fun to see.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure that we're all going to agree on this next part of the show, however, because it's time for pick one. Dave, this I'm actually pretty excited about this.
I can't even agree
segment
with myself on this one.
Dave, I'm actually pretty excited about this segment that you introduced last week. Dave, can we get a quick reminder for what pick one is?
Yeah, it's we each have to pick one product we'd choose from a set category. So it's kind of the idea of if we could only ever have one of those products, or if we had to buy a product from that category tomorrow, which one would it be? So yeah.
All right. Well, last week we were talking about daytime running lights. This week, road pedals. Dave, why don't we start with you, since this is your segment? What is your road pedal of choice?
I don't understand why Ronan has such a pained look on his face.
Because he knows we're just.
I'm wondering whether he doesn't
even
know.
I know the right answer. I know the answer I have, and I know the answer I'll give, and they're three different things.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll get to that. I'm curious. For me, there is only one answer, and as much as I love Favero power meter pedals with the look interface, I still don't love them as much as the Shimano cleat interface. So Dura-Ace pedals for me is, if I could have one pedal system, it would be the Dura-Ace pedal system. Why Dura-Ace, you ask? I think a lot of people think Dura-Ace is kind of a waste of money compared to Ultegra pedals, because there's a 20-gram weight difference between the two. But for me, and this is a fact that a lot of people overlook, is that Dura-Ace actually uses an entirely different axle and bearing system. And that basically means that Shimano are able to reduce the stack height of the pedal and increase the cornering clearance. So I've done some research. The stack height, it's a small reduction. It's 1.2 millimeters reduced versus Ultegra, or 1.9 millimeters lower than 105. But that cornering clearance improvement, you get to basically tip the bike by 35 degrees for Dura-Ace pedals versus 33 degrees for Ultegra pedals. So yeah, a lot more expensive. But given how long they last and how durable Shimano pedals are and how serviceable they are, my vote is to spend the extra and get the Dura-Ace pedals.
Well, Dave, you and I may have disparate opinions on that SRAM transmission stuff in some ways, but we are most definitely in agreement with the road pedals, because Dura-Ace is definitely my pick as well for all those reasons that you mentioned. Another thing that we didn't mention was the fact that the cleats seemingly last somehow forever, and they're also really, really easy to walk in. They are not they're not very expensive at all. You have 3 different versions depending on what kind of float you want. There's no There's no kind of like off-axis yaw or rocking. Virtually none anyway, unless the cleats are really, really worn. And they also just seem to be incredibly durable, not just in terms of the axles, but the bodies themselves seem surprisingly tough. I would say almost the holy grail in that sense, where some of the older aluminum-bodied Dura-Ace pedals, if you can still find those, but the new carbon ones are still very good in that sense with the metal pads. But yes, that's my pick as well.
Yep. What cleat do you use?
I use yellow personally.
Yeah, same. So I use yellow, and I think it comes down to the fact that I'm forever switching between shoes and bikes, that being in a more fixed cleat is not necessarily conducive to always riding different products. So that's why I use yellow. But I brought that up because Dura-Ace pedals actually come with the blue cleats, the middle float. So that's something to factor in, is that you probably also need to buy yourself different cleats for a lot of people buying Dura-Ace pedals.
And they come with special hardware too. They come with special lighter weight hardware.
Trillium hardware.
Lighter weight hardware.
Yeah, that's
fun.
That's fundamentally the real reason to buy Dura-Ace pedals, is you get the better cleat bolts.
Indeed. All right, Ronan, what is your incorrect pick?
Well, I'll say first of all, I agree with both of you on Dura-Ace being the right answer. And then the conundrum for me is that, again, given we're swapping bikes so often, I want a power meter pedal these days. It's just easier to have power across all your bikes. And I'm pretty confident in saying there is only really one option if you want to go power meter pedal these days, and that's Favero Asioma.
Yep.
But I'm a Speedplay fan, and I like Speedplay pedals. I like Speedplay cleats, and as such, I've used them for a long time. And you might think that the PowerLink Zeros that came out last year sort of solved that issue for me. I've got Speedplays with a power meter built in, except they don't really agree with me all that much. And the increased stack height and the increased stance, you know what I mean? I can't say that word for some reason, but is, I think, detracting from some of the benefits of using Speedplay pedals. And also the pod tends to rub on either your shoe or the actual cleat if you've got a sort of narrow stance width on your cleats also. And so for all those reasons, I'm back using Favero Asiomas with the look cleat, and I don't like the look cleat. So I'm like always switching back and forth between Speedplay and look, and never really been all that happy with either.
I should mention.
I know there is a Asioma She option. That's too wide for me.
No, they're horribly wide. I think they're 65 mil wide versus like a 52 mil width for a Dura-Ace pedal. But I have those here. I also have the Favero Asioma, which is my preferred power meter system. It's just super reliable as far as the numbers it gives you. I also have Garmin Rally in the SPD SL version. I just don't love the interface as much as a genuine Shimano interface. It just doesn't feel as good. The stack height's not as good. The cornering clearance isn't as good. So it's a compromise. And then on top of that, I don't know, I've had sort of wishy-washy figures come from the Garmin Rally. So I'm back to the Favero for absolute trustworthy power numbers. So yeah.
Whereas I'm in a situation now where I'm kind of getting to the point more and more where I almost don't want to know how bad my power numbers are now. So Dura-Ace still is the one for me. No power required.
Yeah. Michael Hutchinson, the legendary time trialist on this side of the Atlantic, I think he once wrote, he's got a column in Cycling Weekly, and he once wrote that power meters are like tattoos. They look great when you're young, but the older you get, the more you don't want it.
Oh, that's so true. So true. I am definitely not getting faster. All right. Well, there's our pick one for this week. Let's go ahead and get to our last segment here so we can wrap up this week's show. We're going to wrap up with our usual PSA. This week, I've got one I'd like to share if you all don't mind. I know a lot of people out there prefer to carry CO2 cartridges and inflators to deal with a flat tire out there. However, I know there also are a lot of people who prefer to carry a mini pump.
My arms just triggered.
I think Dave just threw up in his mouth a little bit. But for those of you who are carrying a mini pump, I understand why you prefer to do that. However, if you end up not using that pump very often, one thing that I want to remind you of is to occasionally check and make sure that it actually still works and that it's actually still pumping air, because those pumps, especially if you ride in inclement weather, if it's attached to your bike and you ride in the rain, that sort of thing, those pumps do require maintenance. And if you don't get flats very often, you may very well find that when you do need that pump, it might not work. So take the thing apart, clean it up, lube it up, stick it back together, make sure it's working properly.
It's a good PSA. Yeah, I've definitely been on mountain bike rides where people have needed to use their mini pump and found that the seals are degraded or that the whole thing was so full of dirt that it didn't work. So,
yeah, that's always the best. Yeah,
Yeah.
When you're trail siding, they pull it apart and just a whole bunch of dust comes out. I've definitely seen that happen before.
yeah. So, yeah. And if
maybe, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you do find yourself in the market, at the old place, I literally tortured myself and tested 43 mini pumps back to back, I think it was. I nearly lost my job for that, by the way. It did come with a stern conversation about effective use of time.
Yeah. I was going to say maybe just an additional PSA related to that is that if you're checking your pump, it might also be worth checking your tires, because as much as you want a working pump, you don't want punctures. And if you're heading into a winter, Northern Hemisphere winter, quite often the group rides that I'm on that are plagued with punctures, they're usually the one person that's puncturing over and over again in a single ride because their tires have just like been exhausted the winter previously. And so checking your tires from the comfort of your garage or home and addressing that issue before it presents itself on the road is will hopefully mean that your mini pump has time to die on your frame from lack of use.
Indeed. Thick tread caps are your friend.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this week's episode of Geek Warning. But before we do that, just a couple of things I want to mention. Dave, he's got a new, or I guess maybe not so super new now, but he's got a tool-focused newsletter called Threaded. I guess Tools and Workshop, I should say.
Yeah.
So if you have not already seen that, make sure you head over to the site and check that out. And if you have not already signed up for that newsletter, definitely do that. There's all sorts of useful info in there if you like to do your own home maintenance and stuff. Ronan's also got his own podcast called The Performance Process. That is a members-only podcast, so while you can occasionally get little snippets of that episode, of those episodes, if you're not a member, only members will get access to the full episodes that hit every other week. Ronan's got another one dropping this Friday, I believe. So if you're not already signed up, make sure you do that so you don't miss any of that content. And then finally, just want to remind everyone that, well, if you're not a member in general, you should head over to escapecollective.com/sign up to consider doing so, because it does help us out and funds everything that we do here. If that's too much to ask, at least head over to iTunes and leave us a rating and review. Five stars only, please. But you get to write whatever you want. But yes, head over to iTunes and leave us a rating and review, because it does help more people find Geek Warning, which is always a fun thing for us. And that's all we've got for this week. So as always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.
Cheers.